Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Public Sector Catering Future of the Service webinar with Mark Davies and a panel we will introduce in a second. We'll be talking today about outsourcing public sector services. Our panel includes Julian Edwards, Director at GY5 Consultancy, and Michael Hales, Managing Director at Juniper Ventures Limited. People are logging in, so we'll give it a minute or so. If you've got questions for Mark and the panel today, can you please log them via the Q&A rather than via the chat, and use the chat just to let people know you're here and any views you might have as the conversations progress. It's just still waiting. We had about 300 people register for today, so we'll let it get up to about 150 people logged in before we start things. We're heading that way now. So just please bear with us for another minute or so. Okay, we're beginning to slow down, I think, now. So I'm going to pass over to David, who will introduce today's webinar.
Good morning. Thank you, Andrew. Yes, welcome to today's webinar. I'm David Fode, editor of Public Sector Catering magazine, and today we've got a webinar, the latest in our series of the future of your service. Today, looking at the issue of outsourcing. It has to be said that with the collapse of major outsourcing companies such as Carillion and Interserve in recent years, it hasn't done the cause of outsourcing, particularly public sector services, any favours at all. But it is still true that there are many players in the field who have been quietly and successfully fulfilling contracts in schools and hospitals, for instance. The range of public sector catering, from prisons all the way through to schools and care homes, means there is no one-size-fits-all approach that is best in all circumstances. So the question is, where does outsourcing fit into this obviously complicated picture? I spoke to Mark Davies, Managing Director of ISS UK Foodservices, about this earlier this week, and we'll play that recorded interview for you in a moment. And Mark has joined us live to help answer your questions later. But before we do that, I'd also like to welcome the other people who will be involved in today's webinar. We have Julian Edwards, former FCSI UK and Ireland Chair and Director of Consultancy, GY5. Julian, good morning. Julian, hello.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Lovely to be here today. And I've a quick news flash. I've just been reignited as the new chair of the FCSI. So
thank you very much.
Whatever that means. Thank you.
It's always nice as a journalist to be the cutting edge of breaking news. And we've also got Michael Hales, Managing Director of Juniper Ventures Limited, which delivers catering and cleaning services to schools in Newham. And Michael was also the chair of LASA from 2018 through to 2019. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, and thank you for having me this morning. And my great news is that I haven't been re-elected as chair of LASA, but I'm very delighted to be here, and hopefully we'll have a great discussion this morning.
Thank you very much. Right. A quick reminder, everyone, it gets a bit tiresome, I know, for those of you who are familiar with it, but there might be some newcomers who don't necessarily know just the way these things work. So other than the panelists and me, everyone will be muted. If you want to get in touch during the webinar, you can put a question to the panelists using the Q&A function, and we'd ask you to include your name and your company, please. And we're looking for questions rather than just sort of comments or statements. The other way to get involved in the webinar is through the chat function. If you use that, remember to choose the option to all panelists and attendees. We won't, unfortunately, be able to answer any questions you post in chat. So, as I say, questions in the Q&A function here. Right. Mark Davies has been with ISS for nearly 16 years now. Currently holds a position of Managing Director of UK Foodservice. He's one of Public Sector Catering magazine's top 20 most influential people. He won the Public Sector Award at last year's Cateys, and his work in school catering in particular was recognised by LASA when it awarded him the Roger Davies Outstanding Achievement Award. So let's now hear what he had to say when I caught up with him on Tuesday. Okay, Mark, hello.
Hi, David.
Yep. Thanks for joining us today to answer a few of these questions. And I guess we're going to kick off with the thought about COVID lockdowns. Do you think they're going to change the way that we do business when they're finally all lifted?
I would hope so. I think in the main, yeah, absolutely. I think we'll do business more responsibly, whether that's, more responsibly as business people or to look after each other or the planet. And I think our experience will make us more considerate, certainly of the relationships that we have between supplier and customer and the relationship that businesses has with their supply chain, because I think in one way or t'other, we've all been through a very challenging experience. So yeah, I do will be more responsible, more considerate. And I also think it's fair to say that we'll all be more ambitious as well. I think we'll have all got pent up ambition that is just waiting to be released. And we've all had a bit of time to rethink our strategies and our purpose and our meaning and our concepts and our solutions, particularly, given how relevant we need to be in this post-COVID era. So yeah, I do think it will change. I think in the public sector, we still, though, are reliant upon change in policy, change in funding to really make a marked difference. So, the market, which is the public sector market, the behaviours will only really change if the market itself changes through its direction and its ambition and its consideration of what it needs in the future. And that's what we're sort of waiting for. But of course, we're not really there yet. So we're trying to think what it might be, what that landscape might look like. How do we think that we would like it to be? How can we influence a positive change in the marketplace? And those are all the things that we're doing as a business.
Okay, thank you. Now, some outsourcing companies will have lost significant amount of B&I business as a result of the COVID lockdowns. And I just wondered if you'd seen any evidence that these are now looking more closely at opportunities in the public sector.
Yeah, more rumour than anything real. I just don't think the public sector's quite yet opened up really. But yeah, I mean, certainly B&I caterers will be thinking about those parts of the public sector that are more adjacent to what it does. So independent schools, colleges, universities, NHS, retail, restaurants, and those kind of things that will be much more closely attached to what B&I have done. They might be a bit shocked in terms of the funding that's available, but certainly, yeah, you'd see that move. And then, of course, there will also be moves in organisations that are looking at trying to balance up their portfolios. So yeah, I certainly think that there will be potentially new players or players that have taken a new interest in public sector catering compared to previously, and potentially, who knows, some new organisations and disruptors into the market.
Okay. Now, I mean, one of the things that people have noted is that eating trends have changed. We're getting used to deliveries to the house. Sort of grab and go is obviously sort of growing tremendously. Do you think that's going to start to be reflected in the way that catering contracts and frameworks are drawn up now?
Potentially. I mean, it depends on the environment and potentially what the solution the client is looking for. I mean, certainly what we're seeing immediately is, and this has come through, central government and will be more widespread, this focus on social value. and for those who don't understand, social value has a number of facets to it, including employability, including community, including sustainability, and including health and well-being. So if you think of those are now growing in expectation, then we'll see solutions on those things becoming more prominent in the way in which contracts are let and then obviously governed in the future. I think depending upon what sector you're in within the public sector, I do think that the relationship between the public sector and their service partners has to change, because there's been so much risk that's happened over the last year, and how much burden of the impact of the pandemic should be borne on the businesses under contract, or how much should be shared between the parties, and a more collaborative and collegiate and partnership based approach should be entered into, particularly as we enter into the next however long, with a period of volatility and uncertainty and a rapid change in potential requirement, either whether that's directly connected to COVID in some way or shape, whether there is future waves or variants or anything like that. There's uncertainty in the economic landscape, or there's just the changing way in which consumers behave, as you've mentioned, and how consumers will want to receive those services, whether they are patients or staff and visitors or children within schools or colleges or universities. We've got to be alive and alert to that fact that we are in a changing world, and therefore the way in which contracts are procured and then governed has to have a level of agility embedded within them, and an agreement that there's a more flexible approach. I guess the other thing to think about, maybe it's one of what we can expand a little bit later, but just consideration for the challenges that organisations will have had on their working capital. Lots of caterers will have been burning cash. They will have more debt on their books. They will maybe have a requirement to be paid sooner. They may not be able to take as much of the burden on their balance sheet that they once would have had, which again just needs to be considered when looking at contracts. And I think lastly, just much more openness, transparency. I mean, we've entered into a couple of contracts where you see a change, just because much more open book, much more transparency and visibility of performance, a much closer working relationship in terms of how do you action the changes that you need together as client and customer. So much more together and much less us and them is something that I think will hopefully come into the mainstream as we move forward.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to just expand a little bit on that, the point about the changes we might see, and actually look at the sort of the styles of food service. I mentioned earlier about we're getting used to the idea of deliveries to home, but in schools, for instance, after the first lockdown, then we had a situation where people were delivering food into classrooms, sometimes even outside. Do you see any of those sorts of changes having to continue and perhaps becoming a permanent part of the way that you deliver meals?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if there's things that have worked during lockdown and have been really successful, then continue them. So yeah, in our schools business, certainly this family style service in individual classrooms really did suit some primary age kids. But there are other things that didn't work, and you wouldn't necessarily want them to continue. But certainly, I think that there will be traits from the services that we've been providing that will survive and continue, and then potentially be evolved and adapted. But I think initially, the idea of safety has just gone really high. So the idea of cleanliness and safety and compliance and governance and taking a much more serious approach to the way in which the service is seen by the consumer as being safe is going to be paramount. And I think the second thing, partly because everyone's digitally enabled, but partly because we're all sick of it, and actually we want to connect with people again. And so therefore the experience that you create is going to be so important, that actually really think about that experience, however that might be. Is that in a classroom or is it in a dining room? But what is that experience going to be, and how do you make sure that it's consistently high? Is going to be really important. You have to think about the funding that's available. You know, is the purse strings going to be tightened in the public sector because of the need to try and consider the economic position that we find ourselves in post-COVID? So we can't be overly elaborate. You know, we have to keep it fairly simple, I think, but be very relevant to the things that really matter to people. And how do you make those two things come to life? And of course, I think a lot of the things that we've witnessed on, I mentioned about social value, but this idea about really considering the environment and sustainability really coming into the mainstream in what we do. It was, you know, in our schools business, sustainability was really high in the start of the last decade and went all the way through till austerity really started to bite. And it's probably taken a back since then, and then since COVID. But we think that's going to really bounce back. So we really need to make sure that everything that we do, how we procure the food, what goes into the menu, how do we manage waste, how do we deliver a sustainable operation, how do those things really as a package help the operation and the service that we deliver to be sustainable. So there's a number of things in there as we think are going to change, rather than some of those immediate things that you remember from lockdown.
Okay, I want to move on now. Outsourced providers such as yourself can sometimes get a bit of a bad rap, seen as just sort of taking profit and not really sort of generating any sort of value for money, if you like, with public money that's spent. So I just wondered if you could just sort of briefly say if you're pitching for business, what are the advantages you say that you bring as an outsourced provider?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is I think I'm right. This whole economy in the UK is a service-led economy. You know, 80%, I think, of our output is in service organisations, and for the majority, those service organisations are profit-making organisations that use those profits to reinvest and continue to develop their organisations and provide value to all of their different stakeholders, including their shareholders, but also their employees and their teams and their customers and the environment. So that's the base, the bedrock, if you like, of the economy that we live in. So when you think about the public sector, what should the public sector be good at? You know, what should it really be focused itself on? It should be focused on healing patients, and it should be focused on educating the young. It's their core competency. And therefore, when you think about how do you then look at those non-core services, the choice of using a specialised service provider should be one that's considered. Now, do we have a national infrastructure that it should all be taken to be done directly by the public sector? Well, that's a decision for the politicians, not for me or you to understand. So if a customer chooses to do it in-house or to outsource to a private sector provider or a third sector, that's the client's choice. That's a strategic choice. All I would say is that an organisation like ours, it's our core competence. It's what we focus on all day. It's what we live, it's what we breathe. We work with like-minded people in different sectors who feed innovation, who provide us with talent. We're constantly in competition with others. Therefore, we're constantly driven to come up with new concepts and ideas and innovation. We're constantly looking at the latest trends, ideas. We're constantly innovating, using technology, considering how do we understand our consumers. And we're also quite competent at governance and compliance and, you know, having those things as a core aspect, so we can take on risk. You know, organisations that we work with don't have to worry too much about how we're going to make sure that the service is safe, how we're going to make sure that we've got the allergens legislation and all the other legislation that we have to deliver. How do we make sure those delivered? You just leave it to us to manage ourselves. And of course, we need to make sure that we're doing it within a fixed financial envelope, whatever that price is that customers have bought from us. And therefore, there's some certainty over the economics as well, that they can have certainty when they're thinking about the rest of their budgets, that actually that's a cost that is managed, and therefore they can worry about the other things. So they would probably be the main reasons why you'd say, yeah, I think it's the right decision to provide an opportunity to a business to deliver services for me, even though they're going to make a bit of profit, like the majority of the other service providers in this economy make profit. But the fact is that they should get those rewards for doing a good job. And that's in the way that you procure, and that's in the way that you govern those contracts. That's my view. I'm sure others will have different views.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so that's the sort of the plus side. I guess people might be interested also to know, what do you see as some of the sort of the main challenges that you face as a service provider when you're bidding for public service contracts?
Yeah, that's quite a few. I guess the variability of a bidding process, they're very different. There's sort of rules around procurement, but they'll be different whether you're with a consultant or using a local authority or down with a central government department, and there's different rules and regulations that come at you. So the processes can be varied. The legal terms can be varied. The way in which the evaluation will be carried out will be varied. So there's variability in the process. There's also a misalignment of supply and demand, so there's not very coordinated. So a bit like the buses, you could have not a lot for a while, then all of a sudden you get a flood and you actually can't do everything. People don't recognise this, but the cost of bidding is really expensive in all walks of life, but it costs money. And therefore, when you're going to be investing that kind of money in a team that needs to comply with all of the requirements of public sector bidding, that is quite a significant burden on an organisation. And in many cases, I think this is probably historic. You know, outsourcing in the public sector has been around for 30 plus years. I don't know if that process has really got the best out of the outsourcing market, but certainly in the public sector, many parts of the public sector is overly bureaucratic. Good governance is sort of superseded by process, and access to the customer is sort of fairly limited, and you know, you don't have an awful lot of chance to do pre-engagement, and unless you choose a particular route like a dialogue route, which a lot of the NHS are now doing, you don't have the ability to really start to engage with your customer and test out your ideas before you submit a bid. So I think there can be improvements in the way that the process works to enable, particularly in a post-COVID world, to enable the solution to be worked up rather than a rigid bureaucratic process to be evoked.
All right, thank you. Fair enough. I wanted to ask you now, do you see that there's a difference in the client relationship when you're dealing with like a private company as opposed to someone in the public sector, or does it just vary from client to client?
Well, I think there's probably some generalisms. I mean, certainly, yeah, client to client is very different, both public and private. I think my general observations, certainly in the private sector, there's definitely more greater ownership and empowerment with the client organisation, whether it's through their FM or procurement, and certainly there's much more connection. And this is not criticising the public sector, but it's just so big, you don't have that same belief in the organisation and its strategy. So if you think about anybody that works for a private company, there's much more clarity about the direction of travel that they're going and all of the different things in which they're trying to achieve and their role within it. So there's much more strategic intent behind the decision making. And generally, you know, they've got austerity has probably weakened the governance and the accountability within the public sector, which hasn't been lost in the private sector. So there's much better governance and accountability of your service delivery within the private sector. But to counteract that, there's a much greater understanding of the commercial drivers and the financial drivers associated with service provision. And there's a, you know, in many cases, the supply chain that work with me, they need to have a healthy environment in which for them to operate, as much as I need to make sure that my commercial drivers are met as well. So that relationship in terms of understanding the commercial and financial drivers is much more open. And then largely there's probably a clearer strategic intent behind their decision to outsource or insource and who to outsource to. And that will come through in the way in which you plan for a contract period and how you develop the relationship over a period of time. So I think that's probably the biggest difference at the moment. Some of it has probably been created because of years of austerity within the public sector that's just weakened it as an organisation to do those things. And it would be nice to see that come back, would be my take on it.
Okay, thank you. Now, you touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about like allergen awareness, for instance. I'm just wondering about some of the sort of the elements of the contract that are outside of the sort of the core catering provision. And I'm thinking like mental health and sustainability. I mean, how important are issues like that? And what can service providers such as you offer to clients?
Yeah, well, I mean, call it added value or social value. They've always been part of organisations' reason to be, and I think, you know, we will all be able to list lots of things that we've done for local communities and for the environment over the years. I think that has, you know, accelerated in terms of its meaning with our customer group, and those two topics that you've raised are particularly topical at the moment. And of course, suppliers, service providers can do it. You know, we are going to be asked to meet lots of social value targets, whether they're connected to well-being or connected to sustainability, supporting organisational drive to net zero, local economy improvement, supporting, you know, catering. We think about nutrition, well-being, you know, supporting food security challenges that different communities may have. So these are all things that we do have lots of evidence of doing really well as organisations, and are desperate to do in much more capacity in the future. So yeah, absolutely. There's lots of programs that probably lots of caterers have got that they would want to do, and the key will be, how will contracts be evaluated? How important will those things be in the future versus lowest cost? Because if, you know, the public sector choose lowest cost as their route because of a particular policy direction, then it will be more and more difficult for organisations like us to add value in the way that I think society would like us to.
All right. Okay. Thank you. And lastly, I just wanted to talk about the impact of the pandemic that we've sort of been living through. I wondered, first of all, do you think that it has helped to perhaps highlight the role that caterers play, particularly in the public sector? And secondly, I mean, if you think that's the case, is there any way that could be used to sort of improve staff recruitment and retention in the sector, which has been a long-standing problem?
Well, I think two things I'd say, really. I certainly think there's been an awakening of an understanding of the importance that we play, caterers within the public sector play, right the way across the public sector. And we've had lots of conversations about this, that actually it's got us to sit back and think, actually, we do play actually quite a vital role in feeding the critical infrastructure that keeps this country going. And that's, you know, for me as a leader within this sector has always been something that's driven me, that sense of purpose. But I think that's really accelerated to really understand our importance and the value that we play, which has probably been dwindled with all austerity and this Brexit thing that's been going on for the last 4 or 5 years. So I think that's brought back up into play. And I do think there's a greater awareness in the public. You know, if you think of the school meals issue and you think of food security as being a major issue, and if you think of our health and well-being being a major issue, I think the pandemic has really heightened up those things. And therefore, how does food play an important role in those things, as well as food playing an important role in reconnecting people? Because we've been apart for so long that the one thing that can really bring us together is food. And we play a really important role in that. And I'm sure that we'll all create what we call value propositions around how do we make those things really tangible when we're allowed to get back and do our job really well. We just got to try and avoid a return to this race to the bottom that we've seen over the last 5 years, because what we really want is this value proposition led a market where actually, yes, there's going to be a value for money element, absolutely right. But there could be many more things value for that you could add to that value for money argument. And these things, sustainability and social value and the experience and connected people in order to enable the public sector to do the things that they do really well and see food as one of the means to the end rather than the commodity upon which cost has to come out. And I think if we get that balance right, then we can do some really amazing things once we come out of the pandemic. And to your question, that would then attract better talent and retain the talent that's in the sector. So the market will dictate really how do we keep that talent in the sector. And as you mentioned earlier, there may well be new talent that's coming in from B&I and other parts of the hospitality sector, and we would want them and invite them in to the public sector, but the environment's got to be right to nurture them and see their talents really flourish.
That's very interesting, Mark. Thank you very much for that. That sets us up nicely for the Q&A section of the webinar. Thank you.
You're welcome. Looking forward to it.
Right. Okay, well, we're back live now, and we're going to open up the webinar to take your questions. But before we do, I'd like to get the reactions of our other two panelists today on what they just heard. Julian, you first.
Yeah, two quick points, and thank you, Mark and David. That was excellently put across. You covered a huge amount of ground there. What's jumped out the screen to me was your referencing to social values. David led with a question about mentioning allergens and sustainability. You responded with adding to that the net zero culture and where we need to be as caterers. And you're referencing this under a social value context. And I'm loving that, because you've almost got that at the top of the pyramid. So a company's social responsibility policy is about the welfare of the customer. So that's allergens, special diets. Your values in terms of protecting the environment and people. So I thought that was very powerful. And also on the you're alluding to procurement and the race to the bottom. It is a fascinating arena, public sector catering, particularly when it comes to procurement. And it'll be 25 years this year. I've been doing this for schools and local authorities across the UK. Where we've always, and don't quote me, although it's I can't say that now, it's too late. We've perhaps been a bit accused of being a bit chameleon when it comes to looking at procurement, because we are keen on innovation. We want good pay packages. We want to pay that 10p extra a meal. And when we're evaluating tenders, we put innovation as a big part of the evaluation criteria. The government today, and I can talk about this a bit later, is launching a new green paper that will allow the whole of the public sector procurement to improve, to bring it up to a more transparent standard, which is if you've got a cost center and it's 10% more because of your social value criteria of us and cost X many pounds, I'd score that in advance of giving you a better score for a cheaper food cost.
Right, thank you, Julian. Michael, your thoughts?
Again, a huge amount of ground covered this morning, and thank you, Mark, for all that. I suppose the past 12 months really has allowed us to consider how we can do things differently, to become more aware of our staff and our customers' needs, to sort of develop those flexible and bespoke services, and also to look at other services, diversification, something we've been able to do. Certainly, we're now diversifying into health and safety because we've had such a focus on that ourselves, and we've recognised we have the skills to offer that service to others. So there's an opportunity there that I suppose has been born out of what's been happening the last few months. And again, around social values and the focus on the community. We've been supporting community wealth building, I suppose, in our local authority area, the business we do with the local authority, by not only feeding the key workers like everybody else has been doing, the food parcels to the most vulnerable, but also we're very fortunate in Newham, the business we have in Newham, where there's an Eat for Free program, which is the children who also get free meals, which is financed by the local authority. There was a very big discussion about whether that should be continuing with the current budget constraints, but we're delighted that is going to continue now. I think it's because of the current situation that sort of added the weight to that. And it's also now been developed into a food insecurity task force, which I'll be able to get a seat at the table on. So hopefully we can really start improving food generally for those most in need, and also hopefully get some influence with government and the London mayor and so forth. So it's been a great time. There's been lessons learned as well. I certainly have really learned the lessons of the importance of cash flow and capital and things like that, and the need to be reactive and innovative. And also, like Mark said, it was about supporting suppliers, and we have been very keen to support our suppliers during this time by making sure we paid them as well. So it's important to in those relationships. So it's really now is a time to recover and put all those fantastic plans we've been thinking about into place over the next year or so.
All right, Michael, you're beginning to sound quite upbeat there. Thank you.
That's right.
Our first question is from Ian Gribben from Sodexo about contractual modelling, and here he asks, and perhaps I can address this to you specifically, Mark. Have client expectations changed as a result of the pandemic?
In the public sector, I think it's probably fair to say that the public sector doesn't do anything really quickly. And so we're starting to see a sea change in the way in which tenders are evaluated, and that was before the pandemic struck. And we expect and hope to see that change in the future, in the way that I've described it to be more partnership-led, more transparent, more open, more agile, more balanced in terms of risk transfer, etc., etc. It hasn't quite yet, I think, embedded itself within the public sector across the board. And I think this green paper that Julian mentions, however quickly they can get to it, should continue that momentum. So I think, as with everything in the public sector, it will happen slowly. It does require policy, it does require mandate, and we will see it come into the market in the coming months and hopefully years.
All right, thank you for that. Next up, we've got a question from John Hughes from Notts County Council, who asks fairly bluntly, is it moral that you make a profit from reducing staff and conditions? Michael, what's your response to that?
Well, generally we don't actually staff terms and conditions. If anything, again, in the work we're doing with the local authority we work with, we pay London Living Wage, and we have access to a local government pension scheme for any new employee as well as those that are already with us. When tendering the business outside, we would always 2P people over on their existing terms and conditions and maintain them. And where we want to be is to try and harmonise those staff with all our other Juniper workforce as well. So I don't have a moral quandary on that because we're not reducing staff terms and conditions. Sorry, John. I don't know whether any other colleagues have any thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, Mark, did you have anything to add?
Yeah. I mean, when he said you, I mean, we don't, dilute staff terms, conditions. I think it's already been mentioned, the staff that will transfer to us under TUPE retain all their terms and conditions, including their pensions, and that will be retained. So the issue is, what do you do about new staff? And then the issue is, what is your customer asking you for? And if your customer's asking you for the lowest cost, then is it moral, or are you going to win contracts on the basis of new employees, or are you going to recruit those new employees on the broader, wider hospitality pay rates and terms and conditions that exist out in the marketplace but don't exist in the public sector? I mean, certainly we've got lots of customers that have said to us, we want all new employees to be recruited on the same terms and conditions of those transferring, and that is a customer choice. And we're getting more and more customers saying, we want you to get to the living wage or the London living wage, and how are we going to work together in order to get there? So I do think there's a sea change. I do think austerity has hurt that imbalance in staff terms and conditions within the public sector, but not because of a dilution, certainly not with ISS.
Okay, thank you for that. Turning now to Mark Driver's question, which actually is perhaps a little bit more of a statement. He says, public sector caterers have to compete with private contractors 24/7, but a sustainable business needs to offer a service when the public wants it. I think out of that, the question or the suggestion is that maybe there's not a level playing field. Julian, what do you think about that?
That's yeah, interesting point and question. It is it's the evolution. I think what we've seen in the last 20 years with public sector caterers who would be embedded within a local authority context. So these would be the traditional in-house operations. And then we see the private sector who operate in those same sectors. And what we've seen, certainly in recent years, is there's very little, the difference is reducing. The dynamism offered by local authority caterers, and they do compete head on with private sector. The standard of presentation, the standard of innovation and conceptual approach in the school meals catering, healthcare catering, and other public sectors settings has so the difference is getting less. But traditionally, the private sector, and Mark mentioned in his about 30 odd years, probably 30 to 40 years, we've seen sort of outsourcing to the private sector. The investment there, and at the time, and still is the case today, is about presenting something different, bringing in a new style of catering within in a sector that may be historically seen as excellent in terms of food quality standards, compliance, reliable integrity in accounts, open transparency. This is public sector catering. But it was that they tipped the balance slightly by investing more in that marketing, merchandising element, and we see this out in the market every day. But as I opened, that's much closer now, and so we see some bids from public local authority contract caterers, which are on a par and in some cases better. So I think the playing field is now pretty level.
All right, thank you for that. Michael, can I turn to you for the next question? We've got Jeanette Ori has joined us today. Thank you, Jeanette. Her question is, if you follow up on Boris Johnson's mantra of build back better, what would you do to improve the school meal service?
Okay, that's in the words of Boris, a really important question, Jeanette. Thank you. And while I give opportunity to think about it, I suppose really we've had a great opportunity over the past few months with pupils to review everything that we do. So I suppose there's been the opportunity to become more efficient and more effective and look at our strategic directions and our diversification to sort of meet those commercial drivers that we as a business have and many other businesses have. I suppose there's also around the methods of communication. We've taken a lot of time in training and developing our frontline teams. Through online training, we've had about 2,000 courses completed, I believe, in the last few months, which is great. So we haven't wasted that time in developing and training our staff. I suppose we've also developed our marketing strategy for the next 12 months and making sure that's all ready to go, making sure our resources are going further. And also, I suppose something we've learned over the last 12 months also is around risk and how we're going to mitigate risk in the future. So this is really all about making sure, certainly as far as Juniper is concerned, I'm sure many other colleagues will be feeling the same. It's around securing a better future for all our businesses and certainly for all the frontline staff, and making sure that those in power and influence see that and recognise that. Anyone else want to say anything?
Okay, no, thank you. We got a few questions still to get through, so perhaps we can move on to another topic now. And we've got Robert McLaughlin from the NHS, who's asking what the impact of the root and branch review, and by that I assume he's talking about the hospital food review led by Phil Shelley, what the impact has been on outsourcing. Mark, I know ISS has some contracts within hospitals. Is it too early to have sort of make a judgment about any sort of impact?
I think the answer to that question is yes, too early. I'm not an expert at the healthcare market. I've got colleagues in ISS who are much more expert at answering that question than I am. But I guess just in conversations I've got with colleagues, it's probably a bit too early to say. I think there are NHS organisations that are considering their sourcing strategies as a result of the review. But certainly organisations like ourselves, we are absolutely eager and ambitious to work with our clients to meet the recommendations within the NHS report, and are really looking forward to trying to help our customers to deliver it.
All right, thank you for that. Julian, we've got a question from Gary Atkinson, and he's asking you to look into your crystal ball, because he wants to know what are your thoughts about the future of the office working when we get back to something like sort of full reopening. Any sort of thoughts, any insights there about what we might expect to see?
I'd certainly go with the the British Institute of Innkeeping promotion. They did some months back that you can put a table in the pub, and do you work from there, allowing the sufficient Wi-Fi. But I think it's all changed, and it may never return to that that normality of certainly in city centres where people are now with laptop at home. In most cases, and this is obviously anecdotal evidence, but in most cases, people are much more efficient now in getting their work done. They're probably working longer hours. We certainly are working longer hours, being sat at home. But it's just for this short period. The overwhelming human emotion will want to get back to their office, and friends and colleagues who have doing the odd day in the office now are loving it. So we will get almost to a full capacity, I would say, because humans need to get that kind of interaction. And with that, hopefully will become the repopulation of our staff canteens and our hospitality within our phenomenal B&I sector. Particularly, they're the ones that are suffering with this particular question, and that will get to a point of hopefully as near to where it was in the past. I think people want to be out, away from their homes. I think the desire will be strong enough to hopefully reboot that sector. But we're probably looking at a wee while to go yet, even with the restrictions being lifted. We've got a long way to go, and then changing that mindset back from home working to want to go back and have that confidence to get back out there. But we, as a human race, we need to be out there. And I think if you try and book a holiday in Spain now, everything's booked up. The same applies with applying to get ourselves back into a societal normality of working and living.
Can I just add to that, David? We've got some lots of customers in the B&I sector in ISS, and I know we've got lots of questions to get through, so I'll be quick. I mean, in essence, we think we're going to end up with a hybrid situation where focused work can be done wherever is suitable for the employee, whether that's at home or in a local office or in a pub or wherever Julian prefers to work. But then collaborative working will be in the workplace, and that will be the opportunity, I think, as Julian said, to re-engage with your colleagues, both on a social sense, on a cultural sense, and also on collaborative and important work. So on that context, food is going to be really important in creating that connection. And so actually probably less occupancy of in the way that we once saw it, but certainly a greater importance. And therefore, you know, quite excited about what part food can play in how organisational working and culture can form in the future as a result of this pandemic.
Absolutely, Mark. And we've been, I'm sure other colleagues have been as well, looking at, I suppose, the last 12 months, we sort of recognised that the huge cost of having an office sitting there empty, and in the East London, it is expensive, whether we actually need that type of facility in the future. I certainly agree that there are staff who want to come back and see our happy, smiley faces and spend time with us, but it is about making those times more important and are more important, that social time. But certainly everybody has learned how to work remotely, and that's been recognised. And then we need the office.
Okay, thank you. Michael, just a quick point here. You're sort of breaking up a little bit sometimes when you're speaking.
That's the joy of living in the middle of a field, I'm afraid. So
okay, all right, yeah.
I'll speak more slowly.
I think we caught most of that. Mark, I've got a question from Andy Jones, chair of the PSC 100 group, who's interested to know your thoughts on how contractors and in-house teams can work more closely together when it comes to lobbying government for better funding.
Hi, Andy. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that will be hopefully something that will continue, is that sense of collaboration as an industry, whatever part of that industry you're from. I think, you know, this Build Back Better question from Jeanette, it's so important that we work together as a sector, or in our sectors within the public sector, to influence government about how important it is that we as an industry thrive, and the importance that we play. And we should set aside any of those competitive rivalries, either private and private or private and public, and come together, because actually I think we will all thrive if the market is right for us to thrive, and influencing the government to change the market is probably going to be a #1 priority for all of us.
All right, thank you for that. Michael, I've got a question here from Rebecca Darmpaul about sustainability, and it's a sort of fairly general point. Do you think public sector catering is making a conscious effort to include food procurement in net zero policy aims, or is this something that perhaps is lacking within public sector catering?
I don't believe it's lacking at all. Speaking from my own business, we take it very seriously. I know Mark has spoken about this already this morning. It is a really vital part, and I think our customers are certainly demanding more of a focus on sustainability, and we've been working hard, as I'm sure others have as well, to try and illustrate that, certainly when we're going through tender processes. Some of the added value things around reducing food waste and having competitions in schools involving the children, and then getting the children to follow food waste, not literally, but follow food waste to the recycling plants, and seeing what happens to their food waste and why it's important they don't have it in the first place, and bringing that compost back to the school, so that sort of full circle. All those sorts of things I think are really important, and I think they should continue and be a major part of any procurement tenders moving forward. Absolutely. So Rebecca, I believe that it's not being missed and should grow.
All right, thank you. I mean, Julian, in your experience, how sort of high up the list of priorities is sustainability when you're dealing with local authorities, for instance?
It's massive, and it's where we're at now in the evolution again of sustainability. It's been a buzzword for many years, probably a couple of decades. But these days we're seeing actual tangible attributes of sustainability. So not just having targets and goals, but actually setting some rigid guidelines. So reducing plastics, single-use plastics particularly. Many primary settings we work at, there is zero disposables other than cling film and bin bags. which is fantastic. And so it's about tangibles now. I think people have talked about it, done research, and today we're in a position whereby we can set live goals. And we're loving the idea that there's two elements to this. It's not just about net zero, which is putting back in enough oxygen to counter the CO2 we've emitted. It's about behaviour. So there's always two parts to this. It's contributing back to balancing our airflow, but equally it's about doing our bits. But it's great to see that coming. It's a realisation now, and it's part and parcel of day-to-day operations in the public and private sector, which is fantastic.
All right, thank you. Mark, if I can turn to you now, we've got a question specifically addressed to you from Mark Machin, the Soil Association. And he's asking, do you think that ISS will be able to continue committing to high levels of sustainable procurement post-Brexit, and it also with regard to changes to import regulations coming through in July?
If I'm completely honest, Brexit has not been on my radar. It was until we got the trade deal, and ever since the new year, the winter wave and its lockdown has influenced all of our action and brain power. So Brexit, thankfully, wasn't a major cliff edge in January, and I think we'll pick up on the Brexit issue in the months to come in terms of what impact that's going to have on us. So I'm sorry I can answer that question directly, Mark, and happy to learn about Brexit once I think we can get our heads back around it once we reopen our businesses.
Okay, thank you for that. Andy Jones again. He's wondering whether there should be a code of conduct, if you like, for public sector contracts. Does that something, Mark, that you think is sort of would be welcome and something that would work?
Yeah, there is actually a playbook already out there, which is best practice in sourcing public sector contracts. Unfortunately, it's only mandated to central governments and isn't recognised by local authorities. So it's very frustrating that actually there is a best practice guide that's out there for contracting authorities in the public sector to use, and yet many parts of the public sector, because it's so disparate, don't use it. I think hopefully this will be addressed by the Green Paper. Hopefully that Green Paper won't take too long to become some really enforceable policy, and that gets as far and wide within the public sector as humanly possible. I mean, I know that, for example, there's conversations going on with the Department for Education about this, and hopefully what will come out from the department will be a really exemplar way in which you should be procuring. And I think I said in my interview, it's not just about procurement. Really good procurement is only one part. Before that needs to be about how do I make sure I'm making the right decision about how I set up to source. Do I insource? Do I outsource? Who do I outsource to? What's my strategy? And then once I award a contract, how do I make sure that they deliver on those things that they've told to me? And how do I govern the contract through the contract life? So procurement is one part of the whole life cycle of service provision. And I think it's incumbent, as I think I said, that there's been quite a lot of dilution of the expertise within the public sector because of austerities. Nobody's fault. It's just happened as a result of the policy environment that we lived in. But now's the opportunity, I think, using this Green Paper and the playbook that's out there to really look at the future and say what's important and how do I make sure that it's governed really successfully, and then all of us, private, public, third-party providers, can work in an environment that will allow us, all of us, to thrive and do a great job, because that's, I think, what we all want to do.
Okay, fair enough. We are getting close to our hour of time, so I'm going to have to sort of wrap things up quite quickly. But first of all, I'd like to get sort of final thoughts from you all. Perhaps Julian, I can start with you.
Absolutely. In a 10-second roundup, fantastic session today and some brilliant comments. There are, and I just want to emphasize, we do work to a code of conduct and practice when it comes to procurement, but it's not always met with open arms with certain public sector entities. I'm just going to wrap up by saying thank you for this opportunity today. And I want to just bounce back to our colleague from Notts County Council with his query. I was itching to contribute to that. There's been a quick history of terms and conditions with outsourcing. probably spanning 30, 40 years. So it kicked off with a gradual introduction of 2B, which means that all terms and conditions must transfer in the event of an exchange. And then there was staff leaving an organisation would then be re-employed on slightly lesser terms and conditions. And that was quite at epidemic level, probably about 15, 20 years ago. And bringing it up to today's climate, we're all far more socially aware and conscious, and a lot of this is guided by the national and London living wages. But the key point there, it's the client designing the procurement and managing the procurement. They will set the bar for the tariff, the wage rates, not the contractors. And it's very important that the client is leading on this. So whenever there's criticism of pay rates, etc., and I've been there many times in the early 2P days, we would hike the tariff for labour, the labour rates up as part of the tender, and boost it by 20% when rates were so low. So we were misbehaving, but doing it for the benefit of staff. But we're all on a far more equitable playing field these days.
All right, thank you for that. Michael, any last thoughts?
Again, fantastic. I thought this morning be some great contributors to it. So thank you everybody for that. I suppose one message I wanted to get through for the education sector is really around those that are able to influence government around funding, and that's always going to be the biggest challenge around food funding and policy. So it's so important that universal infant free school meals continues, and it's so important that the funding for that now continue to rise with inflation, at least in the coming years, so that can continue, and the benefits it gives to those that receive it can continue as well. I'll just really finally, Captain, I just noticed Andrew's logo on here, Public Sector Catering 100, and the three of us, I've just calculated, actually have 100 years service in public sector catering, so it's quite apt that we're sitting here this morning. So thank you both, and thank you everybody.
All right, well, I'm glad you found time to be busy on your calculator with that one. Mark, perhaps a final word from you.
Other than Michael's just made me feel really old, just to thank you from me. Thank you for the time to listen and on all the great questions today. And thank you, David, for chairing. I think we're all in this together, and hopefully we can work together to make a brighter future for public sector catering.
That's lovely. Nice way to finish. Thank you very much. That, I'm afraid, everyone, has to be it for today. Our thanks to Mark, Julian and Michael, and to you for joining us. There will be a link to the full recording of this webinar available next week on Public Sector Catering's website. We'll be back with our next webinar on March the 11th at 11 o'clock. As schools come out of a third lockdown, the question is, when do hot school meals become compulsory service again? But we're going to be taking a four nations approach, and we'll be joined in this by Stephen Forster, the chair of LASA, Stephen Briggs of the Education Authority of Northern Ireland, Jane Jones, chair of Assist in Scotland, and Judith Gregory, regional chair of LASA in Wales. A word of thanks to the suppliers who support the Public Sector Catering 100 group, and without whom events such as today's webinar would not be possible. You can see their names on the slide that follows, and we'll see you on the 11th. Goodbye.